How important is story analysis for a screenwriter?
I think it's the main way to learn screenwriting. I think it's actually more important than writing. Okay, maybe that's because I worked as a reader on the job for studios and production companies, and I learned so much on the job. But I think forcing yourself to take apart a script or a movie or a TV show and do written analysis, forcing yourself to write down an analysis of it, for some reason, just gives you a better learning experience than just if you watch a movie and you say, oh, okay, I can see that it's in 4 acts and there was a big midpoint. But if you force yourself to really analyze it on paper, I think it really, really helps.
How much do you think new screenwriters realize this? Don't they think that it's just an innate talent and I have these amazing stories in my head? All that doesn't matter. I need to get my story out.
Well, I mean, some people say just writing is the best thing you can do. Write as many scripts as possible. And yes, that's great, but you can't write in a vacuum. You know, you need to get notes from friends and people who know scripts, you know, in the industry. It's absolutely key that you get notes. And I think talent, you know, quote, talent is maybe a part of it. I think it's just, I don't know if we even call it talent, it's just a proclivity towards expressing yourself with the written word. And then can you do it in screenplay format? Maybe there's a certain ability there that's kind of innate. Some people just can't get it, and some people it comes second nature. But the myth that, you know, great writers are just born and they just type out their first screenplay and it's genius, I mean, that's a total myth. You know, it's a lot of practice, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of craft. It takes a while.
What are the first steps to analyzing a story?
For me, what I call the basic story map is you want to define your foundational elements to the narrative. And that's things like your protagonist, their internal and external goals, the obstacles in the way of those goals, your theme, you know, which is what is it about? Why are you telling this story? There's certain characters like a shadow character, antagonist, ally, those kind of things. And then how are you going to end it? What is going to be the ending of the story? Hopefully you know ahead of time. Sometimes you don't, but hopefully you do. And once you've decided on those elements, that informs then how you're going to beat out the story, you know, the plot of the story. But you need those foundational elements to begin.
How much do you encourage new writers to analyze other stories, not their own? Because maybe they think, oh, I just want to be focused on my story, that's all I care about. But to really dissect and reverse engineer someone else's story.
That's a huge part of learning any kind of writing, especially screenwriting for movies and film because it's so structure-based. You want to analyze good scripts and bad scripts. I mean, as a reader, I learned just as much from the bad scripts as I did from the good ones because it shows you what not to do. And you just get a sense of like, oh, that's not working on the page. You know, or here's what it looks like when Act 1 goes on too long. So yeah, doing story analysis, taking apart existing movies, existing TV shows. It also helps to get a kind of template show for yours. Like let's say you wanted to write a serial killer thriller. So maybe dissect Seven and The Silence of the Lambs, and maybe something more recent, and use one of those as your basic structural template on your first pass. And then when you rewrite, you can change that up, but it helps to just say, okay, here's a structural template for me. Here's an example of kind of what I would want to do. So you find a film or a show that has a similar tone, maybe it targets a similar audience, and then it's definitely similar genre. And that will provide kind of a initial roadmap for you.
Do you take notes when analyzing a story?
I don't really take many notes as I'm reading it for the first time. I'm usually reading on my computer on a PDF, and I embed notes in the PDF for my clients and my students. And so the first pass, I don't note that much, but then the second pass, I will embed notes in there. I just insert notes into Adobe. And what I'd like to do is give them my impression as a reader as I'm reading it. So since I know from being a pro reader, I want them to know what I'm thinking at that time. What is the reader thinking? So like, oh, okay, this moment on page 12, I don't understand it. I'm confused. And then page 15, oh, I see what you were going for now. But I want them to have both of those notes. So they know that even though on page 15, they resolved it, or maybe they had the payoff, on page 12, the reader was confused, So I want them to have my, quote, live reactions as I read through something.
And those notes will be something emailed and also verbally gone over with, like on a phone or an in-person session?
Yeah, usually we have a follow-up Zoom call. If they're a coaching client, we do weekly Zooms, and I just share my screen with the PDF, and we go over them page by page.
Whereas as a reader in the past, when in a prior interview, we talked about your prior time as a reader for studio scripts, that was never something that would happen. It was only just a pass or a recommend.
It was a coverage report, which was like 3 to 5 pages, and you kind of list the major things like length and author and who submitted it and stuff, and you have a little box score, excellent, good, fair, poor, with different elements. Then you summarize it, then you do 1 page of notes only, and then you give your recommendation, whether it's pass, consider, or recommend.
How will thinking like a script reader benefit a screenwriter?
Putting yourself in the position of the reader, I think, is key. You want to know that the reader is going to be clear on what you're writing. You can't 100% know on your first pass whether something is going to be totally clear to the reader. That's why you want to have other people read it. But you want to think to yourself, if this was a cold reader who didn't know the story, who didn't know me, and they were reading this for the first time, is it going to be clear the way it's flowing on the page? Another thing, like, for example, you don't want to have super thick description paragraphs, like 12 lines of text in a description paragraph, because that basically pisses off the reader. They're like, God, there's so much text on the page, it's like black ink everywhere. Like, they want it to flow, and they want it to, basically go faster, so it doesn't take a lot more time to read your script than it does another script. So I think reading scripts, that's another reason why you want to read in other scripts, is you figure out what can be annoying to a reader, what can hamper the process, That's why I think anyone does this, and I learned this when I was a reader. The first thing you do when you get a script is you check how many pages it is, So if you're getting a movie script, and it's like 135 pages, you're like, oh man, this writer, they're writing too much. They really need an editor. You don't want to have a script be that long, unless it's like an epic, and then it's like, well, you should be a established pro or something like that, Scripts used to be 120 pages was the target. Now they're more kind of like 100 to 110, maybe like 105 is the sweet spot, maybe go up to 115. But it's those cues to the reader. It's how long is it? How long is each act? How long does it take before you have a really strong catalyst and the through line kicks in and the engine kicks in, And reading scripts will help you get in that mindset.
So is it where you kind of have to know the system and be, quote, part of the system in order to figure out what the system wants or what might even surpass what's some of the material out there? I'm just thinking of people that would be like, I don't really enjoy Hollywood, I don't want to be part of it, so therefore I don't want to have to think like a member of Hollywood.
Yeah, no matter what budget level you're working at, whether it's indie or studio, people still need to read that script, and they need to understand it and feel the tone and the flow, and it needs to be clear. Even if you're raising the funds yourself and you're shooting it independently, you still need to give it to actors, you still need to give it to crew members. If you want a really good DP, well, they're gonna have to read it too. So it has to be clear and make sense on the page. If you wanna do your own thing, that's okay, but just remember that you still need to attract people to your project.
Okay, so this reader, quote unquote, is not a litmus test for Hollywood. It's does another human being understand what's happening with the story?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best thing to, the best way to think about it. And you don't want to psych yourself out and think, oh, Hollywood readers think this, so I'm going to change this. You still want to follow your gut and tell the story how you want to tell the story. A story map is my very powerful tool that I developed from being a reader and a writer and studying lots of classic movies and television shows, because I have different story map templates for TV and for film. And basically it's a very powerful outline that breaks down the foundational elements of your story, which I call the basic story map. And those are those basic, really important things: your protagonist, their external and internal goal, the theme, the central dramatic question to the story, which is kind of like the main engine, the obstacles standing in their way, and you have to really have that stuff before you go to the beat sheet, which is your signpost beats, the markers in the story. And for example, I give them names like opening, inciting incident, strong movement forward, event and turn at the end of Act 1, and it's split into Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, Act 3. With TV, 1 hour TV is usually teaser plus 4 acts or teaser plus 5 acts. And then half-hour TV is usually teaser or cold open plus 3 acts. And so I break it down very specifically into page ranges. You don't have to hit a specific page point, but it should generally be in that range, because that is the industry standard. And I learned this from studying professional screenplays for both film and TV, and I saw, what do the pros do? What is it that is bought and sold? What establishes a pro writer versus an amateur? And they do use this basic structure, which I call the story map.
How is the story map different from everything else that's out there?
Well, I think my categories and categorization is different than other methods. I think it's more specific. I think it's more based on professional work and successful work in both the movies and television. I think I've probably analyzed more films and TV than a lot of authors of other books. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I know I've spent a lot of time on my method, and I developed a lot of it while I was on the job working as a professional reader for studios and production companies. So I know that it also has an industry standard element to it and a professional element to it. But as far as the categorizations, like in my beat sheet, I think I go into more detail in describing them, so that there's more guidance for the writer.
When someone asks you to give the definition of story, what is the answer you always give?
Oh, wow. A compelling narrative with a beginning, middle, and an end, maybe.
Is story still king?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I say that on my website, right? Story is king. Yeah, I think so. I was just listening to an interview with Steven Soderbergh today, and he said for him, his main litmus test is he has to hear about the story or read a script and say, hell yeah. He has to have the feeling that if he were to direct this, it's a hell yeah for him. So, that story, your concept, your pitch, your log line, it has to make people say, oh, wow, I really want to see that. Hell yeah, that sounds like a really good show or movie.
You think we've gotten away from that because now we have so many great visual effects and different things we can add in that we've lost sight of that hell yeah feeling?
I think in some ways, I think the big thing is that too many cliches are constantly put on screen in film and TV. Especially TV, because there's so many shows, there's so many streaming networks. And so I think they are hiring filmmakers who maybe don't respect story as much, don't have as much experience with screenwriting and story. And their first move is to move something to the nearest cliche, like an actor in a tense scene saying, "This ends now." It's like, how many times have you heard that line, But first-time writers might write that.
That was actually our next question. So I like that. In terms of the dialogue, that sounds very cliche. What about in terms of an actual story of, whether it's a rom-com or a crime, procedural? What is sort of cliche that we keep seeing over and over again?
Well, I mean, I think every genre has its cliche elements or beats, The rom-com has the meet cute. And, I feel like I don't know if it's that I know it's coming or just that they make it that much more obvious now in movies and TV, the meet cute. It becomes more of a thing because it's kind of a term that's entered the parlance. But it's hard to make it unique and original, that meet cute moment between the two soon-to-be lovers. So, it's hard. It's if it was on the page and you're submitting a script, you would want to come up with a unique way to do that, not just another cliche way of, them bumping into each other on the street. Or one of them is an architect and they're holding their model of the building and the other person comes and smashes into them and it smashes the whole thing and, oh my gosh, you're a jerk, you ran into me, but we all know in an hour and a half we're gonna be kissing,
So some of it is cliche, but then some of it is necessary. That we expect that in that type of in a rom-com, we expect, someone took someone's order at a coffee shop and then they're fighting over it and then the next thing you know, they're running into each other later and
Yeah, so there's genre tropes which you want to have. You just have to find a unique way to fulfill those genre tropes, Horror film now, there's so many jump scares, right? And every kind of new low-budget horror movie I see, there's the person in the mirror, when they open the mirror and they get their pills or whatever, and they close the mirror, and then there's a psycho behind them in the reflection. And yeah, it's an effective jump scare, technique, but you can probably get around it. You probably don't quite need that exact shot, or somehow don't telegraph it too much so the audience doesn't know it's coming. That's a challenge of a horror film, is like, how do you scare people when we know the conventions of horror movies? And that's what's gonna make your script or your movie stand out.
And then in action, what would some of how do you make your tropes not become cliche, let's say for action or drama?
Well, you definitely still wanna use the story map beat sheet, or find a beat sheet that works for you. So you're still gonna hit those signpost markers no matter what the genre is. But an action movie, I don't know, you just gotta find interesting ways for the first appearance of the villain, to create tension and a ticking time clock. It's great to insert a ticking time clock at the midpoint or maybe end of Act 2. So find a unique way to have basically a countdown to the ultimate consequences, So how do you create the stakes and the consequences? That's going to distinguish you as a writer.
Okay, so some of that, you need to have that tension in there, but then if the hero is kicking down the door and then two people are bound and gagged, and that's sort of very
conventional.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So maybe you can find a more unique way around that. I don't know.
Sure, interesting. Where do most writers go wrong with story?
Well, there's a lot of ways to go wrong on the page with a screenplay. For me, I see a lot of too dense description, just too much description. I see a lot of explaining in description. If you're explaining what we're seeing, it's not as good as if you're just showing us what we're seeing on the page. So if you say, Tom Cruise crosses the street, that's showing. If you say Tom Cruise thinks about whether to cross the street for a second, then he sees a red car coming and he decides he's gonna run and try to beat the car, right? You're explaining the motivations of the character. You don't wanna do that. I don't know why, it just doesn't work on the page. show don't tell is like the biggest rule. Still applies. It doesn't matter how many years of filmmaking we have. It just still applies. So I see that a lot. I see just scripts that are dragged on too long, especially like the final act, a lot of back and forth. I say a lot of just keep it simple, stupid, find the focus, you know. You don't need so much plotting if we really care about the character and they're pursuing their goal against obstacles and all of that is compelling and interesting and we're rooting for them. You don't need a 40-page Act 3 with constant reversals and tons of plotting happening, which I think is actually one of the problems with a lot of modern films, especially action movies. They just go on and on and on, and they're repetitive, you know, like how many car chases can you have in one film? And we've seen, you know, car chases for 100 years, you know. The recent Indiana Jones, I think it had at least one too many car chases. It just, if it feels repetitive, if it feels like you've already seen it in that script before, cut it and find another way to advance the story.
Do you think that's because, like, a lot of these focus groups, the people say, I love this car chase, and then, all right, guys, we got to put more car chases in, put 2 more in. You know?
Well, I think a lot of it is now they must be giving directors final cut more than they used to, I think, because there's so many really long films. I mean, there's so many 2.5-hour movies. There's so many almost 3-hour movies. And I don't know anyone who's like, I want my movie to be 3 hours, you know? But I think because all of the companies, streamers, studios, networks, they're trying to hire those well-known auteur directors, you know, get a name director, because then they can get the budget and they can get the cast and everything, and that's great, they're talented. But I think they're maybe kowtowing too much to them and saying, you just deliver us the film you want to deliver, because 2 hours and 43 minutes might be too long, you know, for that story.
Now, I just rewatched Boyhood, and I love it. And I know some people said it's too long, but for me, that worked. But I get it. It was over many years that they did it, so you could see character changes. But another thing that I like that people don't is voiceover narration of the protagonist. I know that's kind of a no-no. Can you explain why that is?
For me, I feel like when I see it, it's covering up a lot of what could be just shown, not told information, and what could just be pure good storytelling. It's usually because they want to explain something. And like I said, you want to show, don't tell. You don't want to explain. So if you have to explain something in your story, well, then you might need to change it because it's not clear enough to the reader. And you don't want to use voiceover as just too much of a crutch to fill in story problems. It can work, but I see a lot of newer writers using it when they really don't need to, I think.
How does a writer give story meaning?
It probably comes down to theme and making us root for the main character, for the protagonist, or care for the characters in general. Theme is absolutely crucial that you define that theme as early on as possible in your foundational elements. It's the, why are you writing this? Why is it relevant? Why is it urgent? What is this story about? What is it communicating? So if that is something that is compelling and pure and relevant to our times, and you're showing it, not telling us, and you're not preaching a message, but you're just showing drama that explores that theme, then I think you have a really good chance of giving your story meaning.
Do we always have to like the main character?
We don't always have to, but that's probably a good example. If we don't like the main character, if they're an anti-hero, there needs to be some meaning to the story. There needs to be a reason for it to exist, you know? Or there's other characters that we really care about, you know, like in Breaking Bad, Walt just keeps getting worse and worse. He's turning into this monster, but we do care about the surrounding characters too, you know?
I think you've said to create surprising stories. How does a writer do this?
That's kind of the magic sauce, is how can you hit that signpost beat in the correct page range and yet still surprise us, still pull the rug out from under us? I mean, it's kind of writing. Writing should surprise you as the story goes on. You know, good writing should surprise you, should not be predictable. So, I mean, I think just the trick is ask yourself, could the reader see this coming? You know, is this predictable? And then that's why you want to show it to friends. You show it to 3 friends and every one of them says, okay, I kind of saw that midpoint coming, you know, that twist where the house burns down. And you're like, okay, well, I need to hide the buildup to the house burning down, you know. Or maybe the house doesn't burn down. Maybe there's some other disaster that happens at the midpoint. But that's kind of good writing, is you have to figure out how to surprise the reader.
And is that something it's almost like chemistry between 2 people? You can't really define why it happens, but it happens, it's magic. Is that the part of the writing process that's not really definable, not teachable in some sense?
Pretty much. I mean, I think that's kind of maybe the number one thing, is you can't teach someone how to come up with surprising, compelling story elements, you know, plot points, beats. You can't, that can't really be taught. I think it just has to be in your nature. That maybe it's that you have to have that intention, because a lot of new writers, their intention is just to write something that's commercial and that can sell. And so they're like, oh, I'm just going to write something like X TV show or X movie. But as you go on and you get better and better, you realize I need to surprise that reader. And yeah, I mean, I push my writers and my students to, you know what, I saw this coming, come up with a more surprising beat there. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 passes before they do, but I do see them making that progress. But there are those writers that it just kind of never clicks for them. You know, they're trying to string together cliches rather than they don't have that fire in them to tell a unique story.
Well, I like what you said earlier about pouring it into this mold. And I think that's a great analogy. But if we broke it down again to dating, it's kind of like, oh, I've got this great gal. She's wonderful. We'll set up this meeting, and the chemistry isn't there, and you can go on all these dates, and it's not there. But then you run into the right one, and it is, and you can't explain why that is. So you can make yourself ready. Same thing with a story. You can figure out all these things.
I mean, there's the indefinable X factor. What makes a story, a character, a scene compelling and amazing and exciting. There is an X factor that can't be taught, you know. But I can teach you techniques that are going to get you further and further toward writing something really compelling. I can also, the first step is a writer comes to me and I say, give me 3 log lines for 3 separate concepts, 3 separate ideas. So maybe 1 movie and 2 series. And I'll tell them what jumps out at me, and I'll ask them a bunch of questions. You know, like maybe I have a writer who, he just has this dream. He wants to write like a big police procedural story, or like a Navy SEALs action thing. But his other ideas are better. So we've been working on these other ideas, you know, like he has something set in the tech world, and because he works in the tech world and he lives in the Bay Area and he knows that so much better, but he's never been a Navy SEAL. He's never been a cop. And so, you know, every now and then I say, well, okay, we're working on this script. We've been working on this a long time. What about your next one? Hit me with some more log lines. And his ideas that aren't action and cliche, the ones that are about people and family and interesting settings and culture. He's also Asian. And so I said, work Asian culture into your stories as well, you know? And I kind of had to push him in that direction. It wasn't natural for him. But then when he started to do it, it really jumped out. And I said, you know, maybe you should explore that idea. And that turned out to be a good thing.
That's a great story. Yeah, almost as if people like the concept of something or the idea of something, like a career, but maybe they're not totally suited for it. I don't know if it's the same with story.
I think it's the same with the topic they choose, topic and genre they choose. So like I've had writers come to me and like they love sci-fi movies and they really want to write a sci-fi movie, but they might not be the best person to write a sci-fi movie. They may end up writing a story about their family and when they grew up, but that'll take a while. That'll take at least a few weeks or a month of talking with them and having Zoom sessions and just asking them like, why do you want to tell this story? Like you have this Star Wars-esque space romp. Why do you want to tell it? And if they don't have a good answer, if it's just, I just like those movies, well, that's not a good enough answer to spend so much time, hundreds of hours on something, and then risk the rejection when you submit it and have to rewrite it for many drafts. It's a lot of work and there is a lot of rejection involved and you have to be able to put up with that. And so why do that? Why commit that time and effort and toil to a story that you don't really care about?
How is story maps different from other methods that are out there, say like Save the Cat?
Save the Cat, I have a lot of problems with. I think it did a really good job at the time it came out of making beat sheets and dramatic elements in a screenplay more accessible to newer writers. But I don't agree with a lot of Blake Snyder's categorizations. I think that his method, the original Blake Snyder beat sheet, was designed for his genre, which is family comedy, commercial family comedies or high concept comedies. Like he used Miss Congeniality as one of his pure examples in the book. And it was a great example, and it's good screenwriting, it's a high concept, fun movie, but I don't think his method applies to every genre, whereas I think my story map is general enough that it can apply to any genre. And in my books, I do break down movies of all genres, and then now with TV shows of all genres. With Save the Cat, the beat sheet specifically, there are beats in there that I just don't think are beats, okay? So it opens with opening image. Well, an opening image isn't a beat. It's just that first description, first thing you're looking at when you start a script. And so he was saying that opening image is so important that we're going to put it in this 10-beat beat sheet. Well, I can tell you from being a reader, you forget about the first thing, the first description on page 1 by the time you're halfway down page 1, okay? The thing that you're looking for is what is this compelling story? What is the drama? Who is the main character and what's going to suck me in? And if you can do it with an opening image, that's great, but that's very rare. And I don't think you, as a writer, should kill yourself trying to think of an opening image. It's better to say that first beat is your opening. It's that page 1 to 10, and specifically right off the bat, 1 to 5 is really key. It's how are you starting off this story? What's the first thing we see? Like in Breaking Bad, it has that great flash forward opening, and there is an opening image in there in the original pilot script for Breaking Bad. I think it was a pair of pants flying through the air in the desert, and then the RV like hits the pair of pants and keeps shooting down the road, and so now we're following the RV, and then we meet Walt. But see, the fact that I can't remember what that opening image is kind of a testament to it didn't really matter because it was a great story and that was a great sequence. So that's an example. The next one, either 2 or 3 in the Blake Snyder beat sheet, is called Theme Stated. And he says you want to show something or have a line of dialogue that shows the audience or reader what is the theme of this story. Well, the problem is that most writers now are making it a line of dialogue in which a character directly states the theme, okay? Like the second Wonder Woman movie. There's that opening sequence where the young Wonder Woman as a girl is going through this like trial obstacle course thing. It's a race and she's trying to win. And she takes a detour because of factors that happen on the race. And then when she's almost winning, or maybe she wins, I don't remember, her mother, Robin Wright, grabs her and says, "You cheated. You don't cheat in life, Diana." And that was stating the theme. And I think that writer was like, oh, we have to have themes stated on page 3 of this screenplay and minute 5 of the movie. But that's not a beat. That's just telling the audience, and telling, not showing, because a lot of writers, unfortunately, aren't going to show it in a really active, compelling, surprising way. That's not a beat that advances the story necessarily. Now, if you can combine it with something that advances the story, that would be great. But you don't always need it in that position. So I tell my writers, express your theme through the actions, through the beats, through the drama of the story. It should be clear to us what this is about. It doesn't have to be right away, that you can settle into that as you go on through the pilot or the script. But it should be clear eventually that this is what this story is about, this is what it's exploring. But to say it directly, to state it, I think is too on the nose.
Whereas Sid Field, his teachings resonated with you?
Yeah. I mean, he was the original, and I don't remember if he said show, don't tell in his book then, but he probably expressed that. This is a visual medium, and so you want to show us something rather than explaining everything in dialogue.
Just to play devil's advocate, do you think that at the time Sid Field wrote his book, and then the time that Blake Snyder wrote his book, that just the audiences were receiving content in a different mindset?
I don't know. I mean, I will say probably movies were tighter and shorter when Blake Snyder put out his first book, If you look at films from like the 70s and early 80s, which I think Sid Field's book came out in like 80 or 81, they are looser in storytelling. They're slower and they last longer. So, the act 1 of a movie in the 70s might be more like 40, 45 minutes. But by the time you get to the 90s, it's almost always 30 minutes, around 30 minutes, And there are a lot of classic movies that also have that structure, like Sunset Boulevard, which I break down in my book. That's one of the reasons. I was blown away by it because I watched it for the first time as an adult, and it's like exactly 100 minutes. It's exactly in modern structure and story map structure, so I thought that was really cool. I know a lot of people say they've seen the save the catization of movies over time, that they're just like, okay, that's theme stated, and that's Dark Knight of the Soul, and you can just go down the list. I think that's probably a little bit true, that Hollywood maybe follows it a little bit too much, but that's true. I think that's true of cliche storytelling in general. There's a way to hit this Blake Snyder beat sheet in great, surprising, compelling ways like we've talked about, just as there are in my beat sheet for story maps,
What is a story map?
A story map is my very powerful tool that I developed from being a reader and a writer and studying lots of classic movies and television shows, because I have different story map templates for TV and for film. And basically, it's a very powerful outline that breaks down the foundational elements of your story, which I call the basic story map. And those are those basic, really important things: your protagonist, their external and internal goal, the theme, the central dramatic question to the story, which is kind of like the main engine, the obstacles standing in their way. And you have to really have that stuff before you go to the beat sheet, which is your signpost beats, the markers in the story. And for example, I give them names like opening, inciting incident, strong movement forward, event and turn at the end of Act 1, and it's split into Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, Act 3. With TV, 1 hour TV is usually teaser plus 4 acts or teaser plus 5 acts. And then half-hour TV is usually teaser or cold open plus 3 acts. And so I break it down very specifically into page ranges. You don't have to hit a specific page point, but it should generally be in that range because that is the industry standard. And I learned this from studying professional screenplays for both film and TV, and I saw, what do the pros do? You know, what is it that is bought and sold? What establishes a pro writer versus an amateur? And they do use this basic structure, which I call the story map.
How is the story map different from everything else that's out there?
Well, I think my categories and categorization is different than other methods. I think it's more specific. I think it's more based on professional work and successful work in both the movies and television. I think I've probably analyzed more films and TV than a lot of authors of other books. I mean, I don't know for sure, but I know I've spent a lot of time on my method, and I developed a lot of it while I was on the job working as a professional reader for studios and production companies. So I know that it also has an industry standard element to it and a professional element to it. But as far as the categorizations, like in my beat sheet, I think I go into more detail in describing them, so that there's more guidance for the writer.
Do you have a story map that you can show us from a popular movie in your book?
Yeah, my original book, Story Maps, which is how to write a great screenplay. It's about movies, about features. There's a lot of great movies that I break down in here. As Good as It Gets is one that I really like. It's a romantic dramedy. There's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of drama. And it pretty much follows the story map really well. It's a little bit longer of a film, but I believe the first act is definitely around 30 minutes, you know, which is pretty standard. Even with longer films, the first act tends to be about half an hour. It's just kind of the way storytelling has evolved on screen. But I just think it's a great example of storytelling for film, really compelling protagonist. He's got a lot of quirks and misbehaviors. You know, his main one is OCD. He's obsessive, and he has this germophobia, and that's getting in the way of any relationship, whether it's his friendship with his neighbor, with his gay neighbor, or his possible relationship with his waitress, Helen Hunt. And so he's been pushing people away this whole time, but his true goal is to let people in, you know, to actually develop healthy relationships.
Is there any way you could take us a little bit through the story map for As Good as It Gets? I know there's a lot of moments, it might be too long.
Sure, yeah,
to
there's
do
a
the
lot
whole
of great
thing.
moments. Let me refresh myself with my book here. I love the opening. It establishes Jack Nicholson as just this really cantankerous guy, and it kind of shows us everything about him. A neighbor comes to his door, or he walks out his door, and there's a neighbor who says, "It's tulip season. It's such a wonderful day. I'm going outside." And she sees him and just glowers at him like she knows this guy just puts the kibosh on any fun. And then Melvin Udall, Jack Nicholson, finds his neighbor's dog sniffing around, and he doesn't like dogs. You know, he's a germaphobe and everything. And he picks up the dog and he stuffs him down the trash chute. And it turns out, so then his neighbor comes out, which is Greg Kinnear, looking for this dog, and he lies and says he hasn't seen a dog, you know. So it's just such a great way of just showing what a jerk this guy is, you know. Then he goes back into his apartment and we see all the OCD rituals, you know. He's washing his hands with scalding hot water and soap, and he turns the lock. He has a bunch of locks on his door. He turns them a certain number of times and ways. He has all these rituals, and those are going to tie in the end, because when he finally achieves his arc and he gets Helen Hunt to love him, and he is selfless with his neighbor, and he's a good friend to his neighbor, he realizes he didn't lock the door. So it's a visual device that he's gotten over some of these these problems and obsessions that he had. So they do it in a showing, not telling way.
When did you begin studying Netflix TV shows?
A few years ago, definitely when I was coming out, developing my book on TV, Story Maps TV Drama, the structure of the one-hour television pilot, where I broke down the structure of one-hour pilots from a lot of different networks and streamers and stuff. And I definitely wanted to have some Netflix shows in there. And in that first book, I broke down House of Cards, which was like the seminal that was their first big show that they produced and distributed. So that was a big benchmark for them. And now, I mean, they've had hundreds of shows since then, of course. But yeah, it's fascinating. And writers always ask me about that. And they're like, Netflix has 1,000 shows. How can I get mine in there? You know, which is a normal question, you know. But it is extremely competitive. And the thing is, everybody wants to get on Netflix, even the established filmmakers and established TV people. And for a while, I don't know if they're still doing it, Netflix was overpaying the market for everybody. They were paying anyone more than other companies were giving them. It's actually kind of in their company rules, is if you're an employee of Netflix and you can prove that someone who does your same job at another company gets more money than you, they will raise your salary up to that level. At least that's the way they started. Reed Hastings put in that rule when they first started. But content-wise, I mean, they're a huge studio, they're a huge factory, they do every genre imaginable. So it's an exciting place. Their financials are crazy. Everybody's kind of like, we don't know how they fund so much stuff, billions and billions of dollars of content, but somehow they do it. And so they're a big dog, definitely.
What have you learned about the structure of Netflix TV shows?
Well, they distinguish themselves from definitely the major networks, the broadcast networks, in that they target audiences and topics more succinctly. You know, they're focused more on a niche. That's kind of first off. You know, your broadcast networks like ABC, NBC, CBS, and even a lot of your basic cable channels, they're going for a broad audience. I mean, it's right in there in the title. They want basically everyone. They want every generation of the family to watch their show. So they're not that risky, they're not that edgy, they're not cutting edge with style and tone and filmmaking. But Netflix decided they were going to be edgy and be more adult and more mature, and I mean, in some cases just more R-rated, and they came out with House of Cards, and it was more like a movie. It looked cinematic, and it had nudity and bad language and violence, and it was heavily serialized. So I think they came out and they wanted to distinguish themselves differently from other broadcast networks at the time. There weren't that many streamers at the time. Now there are, of course. But I think the number one thing that they do is they're targeting niches in a global audience. So they know, for example, that in Brazil, Brazil loves cop shows or something. So they're targeting, they want to find a cop show that maybe has a female detective and some other element that they know is big in Brazil because they have all these analytics. So they develop that little niche show. They go out to creatives and say, do you have anything for this audience? And they're targeting it specifically for that audience. And they definitely want a global audience because they want to sell subscriptions to their service all over the world. So those are a few of the ways that they distinguish themselves. And there are some, they don't necessarily use a different act structure, like a 1-hour drama on Netflix uses the basic same teaser plus 4 acts, teaser plus 5 acts that other streamers and other networks use for drama, you know, that I've broken down in my book. Same with half an hour, although half an hour shows now, they either call them 30-minute dramas or dramedies. They are more experimental. Some of them are only 21 minutes, some of them are over 30 minutes. And there's really kind of no rules, really, with those. The majority do a cold open plus 3 acts, but there is a lot of experimentation, which is exciting.
Is there anything different you will find with the characters of a Netflix TV show that maybe other streamers don't have, other networks don't have?
I mean, I would say probably they're more edgy and dark. A lot of the Netflix material is dark, even if it's entertaining and even if it's targeted at a younger audience. You know, a show like Wednesday is darker than something that's on like the CW channel, you know. A lot of their high school shows, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or other ones that I don't even know about, they're more edgy, they're more mature, and maybe that's why they're successful, is they're not dumbing it down for kids. They're not thinking, oh, only kids are watching this, so I'm going to make this material less complicated or serious or edgy. You know, they definitely have that thing where they're not afraid to go dark.
What is one of your favorite Netflix pilots?
So definitely Stranger Things. It's one of their most popular shows ever. Huge audience, and they put a lot of money into it and they really market it because they know people love it all around the world. And it has a really great pilot. It has a really compelling, crazy opening where there's like a monster. And so you know, you don't see the monster, I think, but you see its effects and stuff. So you know you're in this fantasy monster type of story where kind of anything goes. Then you meet these kids and you feel kind of the 80s Spielbergian type of family nostalgia feeling. Kind of reminds you of like Goonies or E.T., you know, so they have that nostalgia element. That's the style. They even show in the pitch deck that they used, which you can find online, they have stills from a lot of like 70s and 80s movies like E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and so they were definitely going for that right off the bat. But they have parallel stories, so they have the kids who are looking for their friend who disappeared, and then they have Eleven, the girl with the powers who's escaped from the laboratory. So those are parallel stories until the very end when they meet. And that's kind of the cliffhanger, like what's gonna happen now that they've met, you know? And will the boys know that she has some kind of special powers? And I don't know if maybe she doesn't even show her special powers in the pilot. I don't quite remember, but you know that something is amazing with her. She escaped from this secret institute. So it has a really good ending. You also bring in adult characters, Winona Ryder, and the sheriff, so you have a good cast of characters, different ages, different generations, different tones to their dialogue, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering is, forgive me, I don't know that much about the show, but that because there's multi-generations and it has this nostalgia element to it, is that why it's had such a broad appeal?
I think it was a big reason it broke out to begin with. And the same with Cobra Kai, which is also a Netflix show. You know, people of my age remember seeing The Karate Kid when we were kids in the 80s, you know? And then kids today will follow the younger kids in the show, and they like all the action and kicking and fights and everything like that. So yeah, I think nostalgia is a huge thing. You definitely see that a lot with shows on the air on all different networks. You're also seeing now movies that are about pop culture trends, like Barbie, and like there's a movie about the Beanie Babies, you know? And so people are like, oh, I remember when I played with Barbie or G.I. Joe. I remember when I had a Beanie Baby. So that can be a huge thing, even if you don't have ownership of an IP. Kind of the general niche or milieu that you are recalling, it could still have a nostalgic element, you know? Let's say you are writing something about an 80s rock band, and it's not specifically about, you know, Foreigner or Def Leppard or Guns N' Roses, but you kind of, you fictionalize. We know that's kind of the world that it is, right? Well, that's nostalgia. People remember hearing those songs on the radio. So that could be a good little window into the world that you could bring in, and nostalgia could help find an audience for that.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is true for other generations, but it seems like younger people now, they like music from a few generations ago because there's the debate, when was the best film and music? Well, it was, whatever, and it's not current.
Yeah.
And so some of that is like, I don't know if that's true for other generations, that they liked maybe 20 years prior content, but...
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I'm actually writing a pilot. I have a pilot that's set in the hair metal era in 1991 in LA. And so I think about nostalgia a lot, and I think about older trends. When I was a kid, we romanticized the 60s, right? I remember my older brother even saying, I wish I was born 10 years earlier so I could have been like a teenager in the 60s. I could have seen the Doors and Led Zeppelin and The Who and all this stuff. And that was the music he listened to. He didn't listen to that much modern music, even though there was great stuff happening at that time. But so we romanticized the 60s, my generation. Now I think they definitely romanticize the 80s, but now they're getting to the 90s. And it's an era that they were maybe really little kids, or they weren't even born yet. And so they're having their own ideas about it, and they're seeing kind of elevated, examples of it in film and TV, that maybe weren't quite accurate to the time, but they're being made into kind of caricatures and stuff. And the music and the movies they're discovering for the first time. You have I call it needle drops now. So in shows like Euphoria and Stranger Things, they're actually writing about what songs they have in each episode, and some of them break out.
What are the keys to making audiences binge watch a Netflix series?
Well, Netflix from the get-go was heavily serialized. So they are not afraid to do a lot of plotting. They're not afraid to have cliffhangers, but they're not too reliant on big cliffhangers because they know you're just going to go to the next episode. So it's not like you're going to be waiting for a week, But one thing they do is they don't bother to recap the previous episode because you're binging and they know you just watched it. I have seen a few shows lately on other streaming services like Max and Hulu and stuff, and they do it not just the previously on, but they'll kind of back up the story in the next episode. They'll start with like a minute or so showing the ending of the previous episode, and I'm like, why are you doing that? Because we're binging it. This is a streaming service. So that's one thing they don't worry about. But I think they go for high concepts. They go for ideas that are pretty crazy and edgy, and they, like I said, they target areas of the world and markets, very niche-oriented targeting. They use their analysis to know what audiences are interested in. So maybe that's the thing, is they know if they're giving an audience something that they know they want in Sri Lanka or whatever, they know they're gonna binge it. I don't know, does that touch on that?
Yeah, but we had Nielsen ratings, and so it's interesting how somehow this seems like they really have the viewer dialed in more so than Nielsen.
They have a lot more analytics than they did back in the Nielsen days. And also they're thinking about the whole world. Before it was North America, it was, Friends is going to attract 18 million people on a Thursday night, and the main demo is 18 to 35, for example, and maybe more women watch it than men. Maybe it's like 60-40% or something like that. But now they know, like in Indonesia, these are the genres that they watch in this region, and this is however many minutes they watch before they tune out and go somewhere else. Now they know what audiences are watching in other countries down to the region, and they know the gender and the ethnicity and the age and where they live, and they have all these analytics for what topics and what genres they watch, and they know how long of the episode they watch before they stop and tune out. They know if they come back to it to finish the episode, or they know if they never come back to it, and then what do they go to next. So maybe they're just sampling that comedy, but they bailed out on that comedy 2 minutes in, decided they didn't like it, and they went to Extraction, the movie with Chris Hemsworth. So now they're like, oh, okay, they're more interested in action movies. And they watched all of Extraction, and then they watched Wednesday. So they have so much data that it's just a lot more targeted these days.
Are there any don'ts when it comes to writing a series for Netflix?
I would say just try to not make it feel like a broadcast series. Probably avoid procedurals, I would say. Procedurals are, the case of the week type of shows. They're mostly on broadcast networks. There are a few on streamers like Poker Face, I guess is a pretty big hit, and that's kind of a Columbo type of mystery thing where there's a different story every week, a different case every week. But Netflix isn't really doing those, so you probably want to avoid procedurals. And it probably does need to be more edgy or dark or high concept than your genre audience normally would be on a broadcast network. So a cop show on ABC is probably too broad and too safe for Netflix. They want something more edgy. They want more of a cultural element maybe, a setting that we haven't seen before. So really drill down on something specific, be specific.
Okay, so maybe then like an informant, and he's not normally part of the force, but they're going to pay him to infiltrate this world because they know that person knew that world or something, and so shows
maybe
his life.
Maybe like Narcos was a big hit for them. There had probably compare like Narcos versus Miami Vice,
True. Okay.
I'm sure Narcos is a lot more intense, and there's going to be more violence and sex, and it's just going to kind of be more mature. It's going to have a bigger budget. It's going to look more cinematic than a cop show on ABC.
I think you said previously that you were hoping a writer would do something new with the superhero format. Has anything changed in the last few years?
I feel like there were more experimental movies with superheroes a while back, maybe 10 years ago than there are today, probably because there's so much money and there's so much budget thrown into so much superhero material. Maybe, lower budget filmmakers are not exploring that genre as much, but they're definitely saying there's audience fatigue with superhero movies and shows, and we'll see how that plays out. I know that studios and streamers are worried about that,
Well, it would take such a budget, though, to pull that off, except for maybe The Greatest American Hero, the TV show. That's different, but most of this is just going to be over-the-top special effects and just...
Well, I think there's room there for someone to tell a really compelling human drama with someone who has, quote, superpowers and maybe does something heroic. I think there is room for a unique storyteller to tackle that genre and just turn it on its head.
Are you still bored by some of the superhero action films of today?
Yeah, definitely. I'm getting more bored by them, actually. And I have been, although I used to be a huge Marvel fan, I'm still a Marvel fan. I still actually collect comics. I collect more DC comics than Marvel. I'm a Batman fan. But I think Marvel's putting out too much stuff, and some of it I'm not even bothering to see in the theater. I'm definitely not bothering to see streaming shows. I used to watch every one of them, and there's already been a few that I haven't really watched, which is they're just not compelling me. And I see a lot of the same tropes and, recycled through various movies. And especially the action, there's only so many ways you can shoot and stage, kung fu fight or something, or a battle with two people who can fly. It's getting a bit stale, I think. But that doesn't mean they can't turn it around. It doesn't mean they can't do something fresh in the same way they did with when Black Panther came out. That was very fresh. It had a cultural perspective that they hadn't had before that. And there's always the opportunity to bring something new into that world.
So is it really boiling down to story? It's lacking in story?
I think so. Story. I do think there is a visual element that could be played with. I've seen people online criticize Marvel's color palette in their movies. They say DC movies have better color grading. They just pop better visually. And I never really thought that, but it might be a part of it. You know, they might want to play a little bit more with visuals, with genre tropes. Sometimes they want to take a character and kind of put them into a genre that you wouldn't normally think of. There was a Marvel show, I think it was that one with the werewolf, and there was like they shot it like a black and white kind of old horror movie. And it kind of came and went. Maybe it didn't click, but when they can do experimentation with that, I think that's good. I also think that they're relying too much on comedy. I mean, believe it or not, I want to take my superheroes more seriously. Like, I don't want every one of them to be cracking jokes and for us to be making fun of them, you know? I know it may sound silly, but like Thor is a serious character to me, you know? I don't want it constantly, the whole movie, they're making fun of Thor. I just think there's too many jokes and they're falling flat a little bit.
What do you want from superhero movies as a fan, and what do you want from superhero movies as an analyst?
Well, as a fan, I think we all want to see characters that we loved in the comic books come to life. But the thing is, fans usually want to see them come to life how they envision them, you know? Like if there's a change of a race or a gender, you know, they say, that's not the Captain Marvel I grew up with, you know? But story-wise, I do think really good writing is huge. A good story is huge, and a director who can bring that story to life is huge. I think they need to take their world very seriously. In a lot of instances, they do need to change less from the comic book. Miss Marvel was a good example of that. I was a big fan of Kamala Khan, she's a Pakistani teenager who lives in Jersey City. And when she came out in the comic books, it was very fresh. They hadn't had many superheroes of color. They hadn't had many teenage girl superheroes, and certainly not a Pakistani Muslim in America. And a lot of people were up in arms. Like, this isn't my superhero I grew up with. But I started reading the comics and they were really great. And I really was rooting for her, and I really liked seeing that culture. But she had a very specific backstory with how she got her powers. And they made the Disney Plus show, and they changed that. And they changed her powers because they were kind of close to Reed Richards of Fantastic Four. Like, she can grow big and she can stretch her limbs and stuff. So they thought that would be too close. This is what I've heard. Then it would be too close to a Fantastic Four movie when they do that. So they changed it too much. They also made, I think they kind of had too much of an emphasis on a political point in history that they were tying in. And they brought that into her backstory, and they made it an element behind her powers. And so in that instance, I felt they changed too much from the comic book, and I felt like it diluted the story and the story elements that made it so fun and so compelling for me, you know. But I mean, maybe it gathered a whole new audience of other people who weren't, middle-aged Gen Xers still reading comic books.
Don't write for the lowest common denominator. Write for your intelligence.
Write something that you would want to see. Write something that is smart, that you would think was smart and clever and compelling. A lot of new writers are like, oh, I'm just going to write one of these Hollywood movies, you know, these commercial Hollywood movies. They're so dumb, and they have car chases, and they have, they don't adhere to physics, and they're throw in a sex scene and some violence, and that'll make a great script, right? Well, that's not going to impress the readers in the business who read hundreds of scripts, all the time. Avoid the cliches, avoid the tropes, do it your own way, and try to make your story stand out because it's not like something else. It's unique.
But at the same time, make sure it ticks off certain timings or, as you said before, fits into a mold. It can't just be a free-for-all.
Yeah, I think structurally, you want to at least learn the industry standard form first before you experiment with it. And you do want to be aware of it. You know, like I said, you don't want to write a 150-page screenplay when today scripts are max 120 pages, you know, and most of them are less. So you do want to know the form. You do want to know that usually Act 1 is around 30 pages. You do want to know that usually Act 2, the end of Act 2 is going to be in the 80 to 90 page range, and it's usually going to involve the main character really hitting bottom and kind of the conflict spiking more than ever. And then there's a turn in the story, there's something shocking, maybe opens a gateway, they go through that gateway, and that gets them into Act 3, which is new dramatic territory, and the stakes are raised, and there's a ticking time clock, and we're on the edge of our seats wondering what's going to happen in that climax and if they're going to achieve their goal. That may sound like a lot of strictures and too generic of guidelines, but there's actually a million things you could do within those guidelines, and they're done all the time by great movies and great TV shows, all genres, all types of tones and themes and subject matter.
I like that. So yeah, so there's structure, but within that structure, within each little part, you have freedom.
Yeah, and it's your job as a writer to execute something that does feel fresh, that is surprising to that reader. But ideally, you do stay within those structural parameters, you know. You don't have to adhere to it exactly, you know. If you feel like your Act 2 ends on page 72 and not page 90, that's okay. You know, I mean, ultimately, it's, do we want to turn the page? Do we want to keep reading? Do we want to keep watching this show? You know, keep me entertained.
What is on-the-nose dialogue?
On-the-nose dialogue is dialogue that is generic. It is describing something that we could easily see, that is clear in the scene. It's explaining something. It's just kind of like lazy dialogue that doesn't show that character's voice.
Is there ever a time when it's okay to write on-the-nose dialogue?
Every now and then, you may have a complicated sequence that you want to help the reader check in and kind of orient themselves. So you might have a character say something, you know, why did you bring, you know, I told you to bring the red car, why did you bring the blue car, you know? So then that reminds the reader that, oh, they switched cars back there, remember that, you know? So you might want to plant something that is a bit on the nose. You know, I don't feel like a writer should feel the pressure to write, you know, Sorkin-esque dialogue for every single character. Every single character doesn't have to have incredibly stylized dialogue. The show Succession does. Somehow they get away with it. Every character is clever and makes incredible quips just off the top of their head. And every character has really genius put-downs of other people. But somehow it works on that show, but it doesn't work in most scripts where you don't want your characters to talk the same. You definitely don't want them to have the same style of dialogue.
Can it be done almost if it's kind of like making fun of itself?
Like kind of a self-reverential dialogue?
Or almost trying to, I don't even know what the word would be, but just certain things that are just, I wouldn't say campy, but you're trying to almost make it a joke. And so it's over the top, on the nose dialogue because it's sort of like a joke on itself.
I mean, you could. There's, there's playing with the genre or winking to the audience that you might want to do. Yeah, it really depends on the material.
Sure. What if, you had said earlier that the characters should sound separate from each other. What if a writer is getting the note that all of their characters are sounding the same, but they think, no, these are all individuals?
I've gotten that note too. It's tough because when you read your own work, they seem distinctive, but to other people sometimes they don't. It might help to write down backstories for your characters. It helps to read it aloud. It helps to have a reading with friends. I do readings over Zoom now, so it's really easy to do. And just to hear it spoken out loud, I think does really help. But I think the main thing is to know your character's goals and their wants in general, and then also in that particular scene. So then that will inform how they speak. You know, if they want this out of that other character, they would talk in this way, you know, because they're trying to maybe sway the other character. Ideally, the audience is in on that too. It knows their wants. That was something that David Mamet always said. He said the only thing an actor needs to know is what they want in the scene, and ideally the audience knows that too. Doesn't always have to be. I mean, maybe you want to surprise us. Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, Vince Gilligan, and the writers on those shows, they do a really interesting style of discovery where at the end of each scene comes kind of like the reason why the scene existed. Like it's that moment of discovery that we didn't see coming, and that's truly the thing that advances the story. Before that, there's just really compelling character work, you know, and compelling dialogue. But at the end of the scene, we realize, oh, that's what he meant when he said that earlier, and that's what they were going for, and oh, I didn't see that coming. There's some kind of discovery. You know, that's how Walt is going to get out of this trap. You'll see it if you watch, especially Better Call Saul. There's always that kind of discovery that they build up to in a scene, and it's really great work.
How does a character's internal and external goal factor into their dialogue?
It's very key for their dialogue. It's very important. The external goal is their action goal, their physical goal that they need to achieve, kind of like the A story goal. Maybe it's the most obvious or most visual goal. And then the internal, like it says, it's going to be more emotional. It might be the love interest. It might be their family, or it might be just kind of a secondary active goal, but it's not as important as the external. Unless later they flip and maybe the internal becomes more important than the external. If you know your character's external and internal goal, I think it's really going to help you write your dialogue, because then you're writing their dialogue to show what they want and to get them actively toward their goal, you know. We're essentially selfish people, so when we speak, it's because we're trying to get somewhere, we're trying to get something, you know. So it really helps to know their goals.
What are your thoughts on monologues in screenplays?
Don't make them too long. I think maybe one or two long dialogue passages are okay. But especially for new writers, you don't want to have super, super long dialogue blocks and too many monologues. Just saw Oppenheimer, and Christopher Nolan has a lot of expositional and explanatory dialogue, but it makes sense because they're all scientists and they're going back and forth about all of these scientific topics, and they're just giving detail after detail. And it's you are okay with it more because visually he's a stunning director, you know. The big screen experience is important to him, and I saw it in a theater, and it is interesting to watch. But on the page, I'm guessing it would just be so much long dialogue, on the nose dialogue scenes with so much exposition, and I'd be like, oh my God, when are they going to stop talking about fission versus fusion, you know? So a newer writer who doesn't have that track record, who isn't known for something, like Aaron Sorkin might be known for monologues, but you're not. So you really want to keep the dialogue as tight as possible. Maybe with a few flourishes every now and then. Maybe you do have a key monologue once or twice in your script that ideally it captures theme, it explores the theme, what your story's about.
I didn't see Ty West's X, but I've heard on Twitter, I've seen people just raving about, I think her name was Mia Goth, her ending sort of monologue, and they just said that it was fantastic.
I haven't seen that either.
Okay, yeah.
But I mean, that's tricky to end a movie on a monologue and have it work. That is tough. I actually have a client now, he has a very specific line he wants to end his whole feature screenplay with. And I don't think it works because I think it's too on the nose and it's him making a point. It feels like the writer's making a point, and I say it pulls me out, and we're supposed to feel good for this character. They have achieved their goal. They have come into themselves, and they are more confident now, and we're happy for that arc. And then he has this last line in which it's really negative. He's like calling out someone and basically, saying, screw you. And he likes it. I don't like it. I think it's too negative because it's mainly a comedy, the script. So, it's endings are tough. There's a film called Barbarian also that was another low-budget horror film. And I don't think they really had a strong ending. It just evolved into kind of fighting, just physical blocking. And I think it would have been great if they had worked on the script maybe a little bit longer and worked on that ending.
What confuses a new screenwriter the most?
I think it's voice on the page. It is selecting a word choice that captures tone and style and developing their original voice on the page. It's a big thing. It is not totally quantifiable. I mean, you can't really teach someone their voice. It's literally which words do you choose in a description paragraph to capture the moment. And I think new writers don't quite get how important tone is, how important it is to capture the style and tone of a moment, of an individual scene, or even just a second of screen time. They should think as if they're watching that movie or TV show at that moment. What would the audience feel in that moment? And then try and recreate that with words on the page. It might apply to paragraph breaks. It might, punctuation might help. White space versus text. Everything adds up to creating the tone of that particular scene and the pace and the style. And you can't fully teach that, but I can give them enough notes and even like edits, and I can say, here's how you might rewrite this description. Maybe if you use a word that's a little bit stronger here, this one seems a little flat. I can push them in that direction, and then hopefully they'll get into the groove and feel their voice on the page, and it'll get to be second hand.
Do you ever have a writer think that they have a distinct voice, but it turns out they're really emulating their favorite author or screenwriter?
It happens. Like I've had writers write like really staccato, short description lines, and it's kind of just like too much, It's too choppy. So, the opposite of that is those big, thick description paragraphs. You don't want those either. But you do want kind of a balance between, smaller description paragraph, maybe just one line of description, maybe a bigger one, use white space, it should flow. You don't want too long of monologues in your dialogue. It is hard to quantify, but the page, a good comedy page, feels different and maybe even looks different than a good biopic page,
What are the biggest mistakes you see made over and over again in screenplays?
I would say not capturing tone, the tone of the scene in both description and dialogue, having characters not have distinctive voices in their dialogue, too long, pacing's too slow, on-the-nose dialogue, not getting us into the story as fast as possible. Because when that reader starts your script, from the get-go, they want to know what the story is. What is the concept? What is the engine? What am I watching? And it doesn't mean you have to launch the engine at the bottom of page 1. Of course, you can let it play out and take some time and surprise us, but just know that you can't have 30 pages of just setup before you even introduce any of the main engines or main story elements. We're looking for what makes this unique and what is the journey we're going to follow.
Can you explain what engine means?
An engine is a character pursuing a goal against obstacles. And it's preceded usually by a catalyst. So they're thrown into a situation in which they're now pursuing a goal and there are antagonistic forces against them. Usually your goals, internal and external, those are both engines. So will the hero defeat the villain? That's your external engine. They're fighting to catch the villain, and the villain is fighting against them, or there's other factors in the way, obstacles. And then external, will they reunite with their spouse? Okay, so that's more of an emotional, maybe romantic engine, but it's still an engine. They want to win back their spouse, and there are obstacles in between, and so you can call that an engine, what's driving the story. With a TV series, I like to define the compelling crisis, which is like the core of the drama. It's the core problem that show is showcasing. And it's usually an engine. It's, will this character achieve this, against these obstacles? It's kind of a mini log line, if you will. So you want to know what that core crux problem is. You probably want one, in a pilot, you want an A and a B story, definitely. You might have a C and a D. You probably don't want to have, also an E, F, G, H, I, J story. You don't want to have too many engines going, unless it's a multi-character piece like White Lotus, like the White Lotus. But even there, I think you really only have 4 separate engines, 4 separate camps, with the different characters. I think in season 2, maybe there were more characters, there was more going on, but that's a specific type of story, and it's an ensemble piece, it's a multi-character, and those are tougher to write, but that is a route you could go.
Can we define what tone is? Can we give an example?
Tone in screenplays is really word choice to create the feeling of a scene. And it's hard to quantify because there's, a billion words you could use to capture a certain scene, and that's really the special sauce that the writer brings. What words, punctuation, black versus white space on the page are they going to use to capture that tone? But if you think of, so something like Get Out, which has a creepy, scary tone, that's probably going to look different on the page than, As Good as It Gets. And it's hard, it depends on the example, of course, but I'm always trying to help my writers with the tone on the page, just saying, if this is horror, should we be scared right now? Should we not? And sometimes with newer writers, it's hard to tell, They're using kind of maybe more matter-of-fact words when I'll say, well, maybe use stronger words, maybe cut this sentence off with a dash, and so what's coming next will feel more abrupt, and maybe we picture it in our head different. I've always have the projector going in my head. I'm always picturing the scenes, playing on the screen, as anyone does when they're reading a screenplay. They should be, You're picturing the movie or the TV show that's playing out. So you want them to picture it as much as close as possible to your version of the movie, you know. That's impossible to do, and that's why you don't want to direct on the page. You don't want to use directorial terms, you know, pan left and close up, extreme close up. You don't want to write like the director, like write camera references. Because really you can't explain how a scene looks or how a shot looks. You know, you couldn't really, if I explained a shot of a desert, it doesn't mean you would think of it exactly like it appeared in Lawrence of Arabia. You know, we would have different thoughts about what that desert shot looked like. So you don't want to try that much, go that far to over-explain. But word choice is really, really important, and tone and feeling. Spielberg always said, when he's listening to a pitch, he says, what is the audience feeling now? You know, so I want to know how it would feel if I was the audience member of this script I'm reading.
So if I'm reading a script, let's say for the Swingers, and I don't really know the movie, versus The Hangover, the two tones are definitely going to, even though there's like a similarity with some of it, not totally, but there's going to be an obvious difference in this tone if it really works. I'm going to feel a different...
There should be, yeah. I mean, those are both comedies, so maybe those are a little close, but the Coen, if you look at Coen Brothers scripts, No Country for Old Men has some really interesting kind of literary text. They use a lot of kind of more lofty language in their descriptions than you would normally use in a script, and they use a lot of description, more than I think probably a new, unestablished writer should use. But if you get a chance to read No Country for Old Men, that's really interesting. Whiplash by Damien Chazelle, that has some really interesting tonal choices. Yeah, it's all about the words that you choose. That's writing.
Can you tell the difference between a screenplay where the goal is just to sell it versus the goal is to tell a compelling story?
I think so. Usually the one that they're only writing because they want to sell it, you just don't feel passion for the story. It's usually flatter. It's just written flatter. There might be elements thrown in that come out of nowhere. They're not motivated. I mean, motivation is huge, and I feel like it gets more and more important for me the more scripts I read, more books I read, and the more movies I watch. The more motivated actions are in a script, just the better. I don't know why, but film is a visual medium, and you want to see if your character does something or they come upon something, we kind of want setup for it. We want to have something be motivated. We want to know why or how they got to this point. And a lot of beginner screenplays, it's too random. It's not necessarily motivated. I hear a lot of screenwriters tell me, but this happened to me in real life. This just random thing happened to me in real life. That happens, right? Well, movies and TV shows aren't random. Dramatic visual storytelling is not random. As an audience, we do want to see why something happens. We want to see the setup of it, you know, breadcrumbs leading up to the reveal, setups before payoffs, lighting the bomb before the bomb goes off. So motivation and setup are very key. They're left out of a lot of modern work. I think too much. I find that I'm too confused when I watch, especially a lot of newer films. They throw you into the story too fast. We're entering the story too late, and we have to catch up and put together what's going on. Who are these people? Is that their job? Where are they? You know, you don't want to start off with your audience confused. You know, they can be interested and compelled to find out more, but if they're confused and they just don't know what the hell's going on, that's not a good place to be anywhere in the script.